The richest woman in the state wasn't standing at his door because she wanted to buy his house. She was there because of a promise made by a man who had been gone for nearly 20 years. The old white farmhouse sat quietly at the end of a gravel road just outside Ashford, Montana, where mornings arrived with the smell of pine trees and fresh-cut hay drifting through the crisp mountain air. Its faded porch creaked beneath the weight of time, and the weathered American flag hanging beside the front door fluttered gently in the early autumn breeze. Ethan Brooks had lived there his entire life. At 38, he never imagined success would look like repairing neighbors' fences, fixing broken tractors, and stretching every paycheck just far enough to keep food on the table for himself and his 8-year-old daughter, Lily. Life had taught him that dignity wasn't measured by the size of a bank account, but by the promises a person refused to break. Every morning before sunrise, Ethan packed Lily's school lunch, braided her blonde hair the best he could, and smiled as though nothing in the world could ever shake him. Only after she climbed onto the yellow school bus did he allow himself a quiet sigh that disappeared into the cold Montana air. On this particular Thursday, the sky was unusually clear, painted with soft shades of blue that seemed almost too peaceful for what was about to happen. Ethan had just finished replacing a loose board on the front porch when an unfamiliar sound drifted across the valley. It wasn't the rumble of an old pickup or the slow engine of a farm truck. It was smooth, almost silent, like wealth itself had learned to whisper. A sleek black Rolls-Royce slowly turned onto the gravel driveway, its polished surface reflecting the golden morning sunlight. Ethan frowned. People like whoever owned that car never came this far into Ashford. They certainly didn't visit houses like his. The luxury sedan stopped gently beside the mailbox, and for several long seconds, nothing happened. Even the birds seemed to pause their songs. Finally, the rear passenger door opened. A woman stepped onto the gravel with quiet confidence. She looked to be in her mid-30s, dressed in an elegant cream-colored coat over a navy dress, her blonde hair neatly gathered behind her shoulders. There was nothing flashy about her appearance. She didn't need expensive jewelry to announce who she was. The calm in her posture carried more authority than any title ever could. Ethan instinctively wiped the dust from his hands onto his jeans before walking toward the porch steps. The woman climbed them slowly, her expression composed but strangely emotional, as though every step carried the weight of years she had never been able to forget. She stopped only a few feet away, her blue eyes settling on Ethan with a mixture of gratitude and quiet sadness. Then she spoke the words that instantly changed the course of both their lives. "My name is Victoria Hayes," she said softly, "and I didn't come here because of you. I came because 20 years ago, your father saved a frightened young girl. And today, I've finally come to repay the debt he never allowed me to repay." Ethan remained silent for several seconds, studying the woman standing on his porch as though he were trying to match her face with a memory that did not exist. The wind carried the scent of dry pine needles through the valley, while somewhere beyond the pasture a windmill turned with its familiar slow rhythm. Finally, he spoke with the same calm voice that had carried him through years of hardship. "I think you have the wrong family." Victoria Hayes lowered her eyes briefly before offering a gentle smile. "I used to think that too," she answered. "For years I searched under the wrong names, in the wrong towns, asking the wrong people. Your father never wanted anyone to know what he did." Ethan folded his arms, but there was no hostility in his posture, only caution. "My father was a mechanic. He fixed old trucks, helped neighbors when they could not pay, and spent more time worrying about everyone else than himself. There was nothing extraordinary about him." Victoria looked toward the weathered barn where faded red paint had surrendered to decades of Montana winters. "That is exactly why I never forgot him," she said quietly. Before Ethan could answer, the front door opened behind him. 8-year-old Lily stepped onto the porch holding a drawing pad almost as large as her small arms. She looked curiously at the elegant stranger before whispering, "Daddy, is she lost?" Ethan smiled gently. "I'm not sure yet, sweetheart." Victoria's expression softened immediately. "You must be Lily." The little girl blinked in surprise. "How do you know my name?" Victoria nodded toward the colorful mailbox painted with tiny blue flowers. Your father wrote your name on the side, so the school bus driver would never miss your stop. Lily smiled proudly. Daddy painted those flowers because I like bluebirds. Victoria felt an unexpected warmth settle inside her heart. She had spent years inside glass towers filled with polished marble, private elevators, and board meetings worth billions of dollars. Yet somehow this quiet farmhouse felt richer than any office she had ever entered. She reached into the leather satchel she carried and carefully removed a small cedar box, worn smooth by time. The edges were scratched, and one brass hinge had darkened with age, but it had clearly been treasured. She held it with both hands instead of simply offering it forward. Your father gave this to me on the day we said goodbye, she said. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. I have never seen that before. You were not supposed to. Her voice almost trembled. He made me promise that I would never open it until I had become the kind of person who no longer measured success by money. Ethan looked from the cedar box to Victoria's face. Nothing about her suggested she was inventing a story. If anything, she appeared burdened by it. Lily stepped closer, curiosity shining in her bright blue eyes. What is inside? Victoria gently brushed a thumb across the lid, but did not open it. I have carried this box across 20 years, through every success and every disappointment, and I still do not know. Ethan glanced toward the empty rocking chair that had belonged to his father, still resting beside the front window, exactly where it had been left after the funeral. For the first time since Victoria arrived, uncertainty replaced skepticism. If Samuel Brooks had truly left behind one final secret, perhaps the quiet man Ethan believed he knew had been carrying a story that reached far beyond the little valley he had always called home. The cedar box rested between them like something far heavier than its size suggested. Ethan reached toward it, then stopped a few inches away, almost as though touching it without understanding its story would somehow dishonor the man who had once owned it. The silence stretched comfortably across the old porch while sunlight spilled through the cottonwood trees and painted shifting patterns across the worn wooden floorboards. Lily sat quietly on the top step with her drawing pad balanced on her knees, sensing that this was one of those rare moments adults remembered for the rest of their lives. Ethan finally looked at Victoria. You said my father asked you not to open it until you became a different person. What did he mean by that? Victoria lowered herself into the empty rocking chair beside the front window, hesitating before answering. When I met your father, I believed money could solve every problem. I believed success meant proving everyone wrong. I thought kindness was something people offered because they expected something in return. She smiled faintly, almost embarrassed by the memory. Samuel Brooks spent less than one afternoon with me, and somehow he changed everything I believed. Ethan leaned against one of the porch posts, crossing his arms again. I grew up watching him fix neighbors' trucks without charging them. He never called himself a hero. Honestly, he would have laughed if someone had. Victoria nodded. That sounds exactly like him. She glanced toward the distant mountains before continuing. I was 19 years old. I had run away from everything I thought defined my future. I was exhausted, frightened, and completely alone. My car had broken down on a highway nearly 50 miles from here. Ethan's eyes lifted with surprise. He never mentioned any of that. He would not have, Victoria replied. He pulled over with an old pickup truck that looked like it had already lived 3 lifetimes. He repaired my car using tools that barely seemed old enough to work anymore. When I offered him every dollar I had, he smiled and said something I have never forgotten. She closed her eyes for just a moment, hearing the words exactly as they had been spoken decades earlier. He told me, if kindness ever becomes something people can buy, then it stops being kindness. Ethan looked away toward the pasture where the tall grass moved gently in the breeze. The sentence sounded so familiar that it almost felt like hearing his father's voice again. Samuel had spoken in simple words that somehow stayed with people forever. Lily quietly raised her head. Grandpa used to tell me that sharing cookies only counts if you wanted the last one yourself. Victoria laughed softly, and tears unexpectedly gathered in her eyes. That sounds exactly like him, too. Ethan noticed the emotion in her expression. It was not the polished composure of a famous executive speaking for appearances. It was genuine gratitude carried across 20 years. He slowly sat down on the porch steps beside Lily. If all he did was help fix your car, why spend 2 decades looking for us? Victoria looked down at the cedar box resting carefully in her lap. Her fingers traced the weathered grain as though remembering every mile it had traveled beside her. Because repairing my car was the smallest thing he did that day, she whispered. There is another part of the story your father never wanted anyone to know. And until you understand that part, neither of you will understand why I have carried this box across every chapter of my life without ever opening it. Victoria drew a slow breath, as though reopening a chapter she had spent years trying to honor without ever rewriting it. The afternoon sun had climbed higher above the valley, filling the porch with a gentle warmth that contrasted with the weight of the memories she was about to share. Ethan listened without interrupting, while Lily quietly placed her crayons aside, sensing that every word mattered. The day your father found me, Victoria began, I had been driving for hours without knowing where I wanted to go. I believed I had failed everyone who expected me to become someone important. I had left behind a life that looked perfect from the outside, but felt completely empty on the inside. She looked toward the distant mountains, her voice soft but steady. When my car stopped running, I thought it was simply another reminder that nothing in my life was working anymore. Ethan remained silent. He had seen enough broken engines to know that sometimes the smallest unseen part could bring everything to a stop. Victoria smiled fondly. Your father arrived in that old pickup truck with a toolbox that looked older than I was. He did not ask who I was. He did not ask how much money I had. He only asked one question. She paused before repeating the words that had remained untouched in her memory for 2 decades. He said, "Have you eaten today?" Lily looked up. That sounds like Grandpa. Ethan nodded slowly. It does. Victoria continued. I told him I was not hungry because I was embarrassed. He looked at me for about 3 seconds and smiled as if he already knew I was pretending. Then he reached into his truck, pulled out a small lunchbox, and handed me half of his sandwich, an apple, and a bottle of water. She laughed quietly through moist eyes. I tried to refuse. He refused my refusal. Ethan could almost picture the scene. Samuel Brooks had always packed simple lunches, always insisting that food somehow tasted better when shared. Victoria rested one hand gently on the cedar box. While I ate, he repaired my car. When I finished, I offered him everything in my wallet. It was several $1,000s in cash. At that time, I believed generosity could always be measured with numbers. She shook her head gently. He would not even look at it. Ethan smiled for the first time since the conversation had begun. That sounds exactly like him. Victoria nodded. Then he told me something that changed the direction of my entire life. He said, "You are trying to repay the wrong person. If life ever becomes kind to you again, find someone else who has forgotten what hope feels like. Help them instead." The breeze moved softly through the porch, carrying the scent of pine and dry grass. For a long moment, no one spoke. The quiet felt almost sacred. Finally, Ethan asked, "If that was all, why keep searching for our family all these years?" Victoria lowered her eyes to the cedar box, her fingertips resting lightly on its worn lid. "Because that was not the last thing your father did before we said goodbye." Her voice became almost a whisper. Just before I drove away, he reached into the pocket of his old work jacket and placed something inside this box. He looked directly at me and said, "Do not open it until you have learned that success is measured by the lives you lift, not the wealth you collect." I promised him I would wait. She slowly looked back at Ethan, her eyes filled with quiet emotion. Last month, after 20 years of trying to live by those words, I finally realized I was ready. But before I opened it, I knew I had to find the family of the man who believed in me long before I believed in myself. The cedar box remained unopened on Victoria's lap, as though the promise surrounding it was just as important as whatever rested inside. A gentle breeze stirred the curtains behind the screen door, carrying with it the familiar scent of fresh coffee drifting from Ethan's kitchen. Lily quietly disappeared inside for a moment before returning with 3 mismatched mugs balanced carefully on a small tray. Daddy says Grandpa always believed important conversations should happen with coffee, she said with an innocent smile. Victoria accepted the mug with both hands, surprised by how much such a simple gesture meant after years of formal meetings served by assistants in polished conference rooms. Ethan sat across from her, resting his elbows on his knees. You said my father believed you were supposed to help someone else instead of paying him back. From everything you have told me, it sounds like you listened. Victoria looked down into the steaming coffee before answering. I tried. Not perfectly. There were years when I became so focused on building my company that I almost forgot why I started. Every time that happened, I would take out this cedar box, look at it, and remember the man who refused my money because he believed character was worth more than wealth. Ethan slowly nodded. He understood how easily people could lose sight of what mattered. Every bill that arrived in his mailbox reminded him how tempting shortcuts could become. Yet somehow his father's voice always found its way back into his heart. Victoria reached into her satchel again and removed a neatly folded newspaper clipping protected inside a clear plastic sleeve. The paper had yellowed with age, its edges softened by countless years of careful handling. She handed it to Ethan. Across the front page was a photograph of a much younger Samuel Brooks standing beside an old pickup truck outside a small repair shop. The headline was simple: Local mechanic declines community recognition. Ethan stared at the picture in disbelief. I have never seen this before. Victoria Ismail Dientli. Your father asked the newspaper not to publish it. They respected his request for almost a week. Then one reporter quietly printed a small story after several families insisted the town should know what kind of man lived here. Ethan read the faded article carefully. It described how Samuel had spent years repairing vehicles for struggling families, refusing payment whenever someone could not afford it. One sentence caught Ethan's attention more than any other. Samuel Brooks believes the strongest communities are built one quiet act of kindness at a time. Ethan lowered the clipping, his throat tightening with emotion. He never told me any of this. Because he did not do it to be remembered, Victoria answered softly. Lily looked at the old photograph with wide eyes. Grandpa looks just like Daddy. Ethan smiled, noticing for the first time how much of his father's expression stared back at him from the faded newspaper. The same patient eyes, the same gentle smile that never demanded attention. Victoria watched father and daughter together, and something inside her quietly shifted. For years, she believed she had been searching for the family of the man who had changed her life. Sitting on that weathered porch, she realized she had actually found something much greater. His kindness had never disappeared. It had simply continued into the next generation without anyone noticing. She carefully placed the clipping back inside its protective sleeve before resting one hand on the cedar box once again. There's one more reason I knew I had to come before opening this, she said quietly. The last person who spoke to your father before he gave me this box told him something that I did not understand until only a few weeks ago. And when I tell you what those words were, you may begin to see that your father's greatest sacrifice was never meant to remain a secret forever. Victoria held the cedar box with both hands, her fingers resting gently against the weathered wood as though she could still feel the warmth of the man who had entrusted it to her so many years ago. The afternoon had settled into a peaceful stillness. Sunlight spilled across the porch, and somewhere beyond the old fence, a meadowlark sang into the open Montana sky. Ethan waited patiently, never rushing her. He had inherited that habit from Samuel Brooks. His father had always believed that the most important truths arrived only after silence had done its work. Victoria finally looked up. Just before I drove away, another truck stopped beside your father's pickup. An elderly rancher stepped out and recognized him immediately. He smiled and said, Sam, one day someone will finally understand what all of these quiet sacrifices have cost you. Ethan frowned slightly. Sacrifices? Victoria Nadif. I asked your father what he meant, but he only smiled and changed the subject. I thought they were talking about money. I was wrong. She paused, collecting memories that had remained untouched for decades. A few weeks ago, I returned to that old repair shop. It has been closed for years, but the rancher's grandson still owns the property. I asked if he remembered Samuel Brooks. Ethan leaned forward without realizing it. Did he? He did more than remember him. Victoria's voice became softer. He invited me inside and opened an old filing cabinet that had somehow survived every passing season. There were receipts, handwritten notes, faded invoices, and dozens of repair records. Ethan looked puzzled. Why would those matter? Victoria met his eyes. Because nearly every invoice had the same handwritten note across the bottom. Paid in full by Samuel Brooks. Ethan blinked. Paid in full. Families came to him believing they owed for repairs. They never knew your father quietly covered the cost himself whenever he learned they were struggling. He recorded every expense, but never collected a single dollar from those who needed mercy more than another bill. Ethan slowly lowered his gaze toward the porch floor. Memories began connecting in ways they never had before. There had been birthdays with smaller gifts. Vacations that never happened. Winters when his father patched old coats instead of buying new ones. As a child, he had simply assumed life had always been that way. Now he wondered how many of those sacrifices had been choices made so strangers could keep driving to work, take their children to school, or simply make it through another month. Lily quietly reached over and slipped her small hand into her father's. Grandpa helped lots of people, did he not? Ethan squeezed her hand gently. I think he helped more people than he ever told us. Victoria smiled through glistening eyes. The rancher's grandson also handed me something else. She carefully removed a worn leather notebook from her satchel. The edges were faded, and the cover carried the marks of many years. She opened it to the first page. Written in Samuel's careful handwriting were only a few simple words. Kindness is never an expense. It is an investment that God allows someone else to collect. Ethan stared at the familiar handwriting, his heart suddenly feeling both heavy and peaceful at the same time. He had seen those careful letters on birthday cards and grocery lists his entire childhood. Victoria gently closed the notebook before placing it beside the unopened cedar box. There was one final item tucked inside its pages, she whispered. A folded letter with my name written across the front in your father's handwriting. I have never opened it because he asked me to wait until I stood beside the people he loved most. Today, for the very first time in 20 years, I believe that moment has finally arrived. The valley seemed to grow quieter as Victoria carefully unfolded the aged envelope. The paper had yellowed with time, and the ink beneath Samuel Brooks's familiar handwriting had faded just enough to remind everyone that some promises were patient enough to outlive decades. Ethan unconsciously held his breath. Lily moved closer until she rested against her father's shoulder, watching the moment with wide blue eyes. Victoria looked at the front of the envelope one final time before speaking softly. He wrote only my name, nothing else. Ethan nodded gently. Then you should be the one to read it. Victoria Hesetatif. No, your father left this in my care, but it belongs to all of us now. She slowly opened the envelope, taking great care not to tear the fragile paper inside. A single folded letter slipped into her hands. The handwriting was unmistakably Samuel's, steady and deliberate, every line written by someone who had never rushed through the important things in life. Victoria began reading aloud. Dear Victoria, if you are reading this, then I hope life has been kinder to you than it was on the day we met. I also hope you ignore my advice long enough to become successful, because good people with influence can open doors that ordinary folks never will. Victoria smiled through quiet tears before continuing. If you have become wealthy, remember that money is a wonderful servant, but a terrible master. Never let it decide who deserves your kindness. Ethan lowered his eyes. Every sentence sounded exactly like the father who had raised him with gentle wisdom instead of loud lectures. Victoria continued reading. There is something else I never told you. The greatest reward I have ever received was never fixing an engine or helping a stranger. It was going home every evening knowing my son was watching. Children remember far more than we think. They may not repeat our words, but they always repeat our example. Ethan felt those words settle deep inside his heart. He thought about every morning he packed Lily's lunch before work every bedtime story, every promise he struggled to keep. Perhaps he had been honoring his father without even realizing it. Victoria turned to the final portion of a letter. Her voice softened even further. One day you may feel tempted to repay me. Please do not. I already received everything I needed the moment I watched hope return to your eyes. Instead, if you ever meet my family, do not give them money because of me. Simply remind them that kindness is their inheritance. If they choose to keep sharing it, then my work on this earth will continue long after I am gone. Silence settled across the porch once more. Even a gentle breeze seemed to pause for a heartbeat. Lily looked up at Ethan with tears shining in her young eyes. "Daddy," she whispered, "Grandpa left us something better than treasure." Ethan smiled as emotion filled his voice. "Yes, sweetheart, he did." Victoria carefully folded the letter exactly as she had found it before placing it back inside the envelope. She looked at Ethan with deep respect rather than admiration. "For 20 years, I believed I came here to repay a debt. After hearing his own words again, I realized I misunderstood his final wish. He never wanted repayment. He wanted continuation." Ethan slowly nodded. "Then we should honor that wish." Victoria smiled, but before she could answer, Lily reached toward the cedar box resting beside the letter. "If the letter was meant to be opened today," she asked innocently, "what is inside the box that Grandpa told you to wait for even longer?" Victoria looked at the cedar box for a long moment before gently lifting the small brass latch. It clicked with a soft metallic sound that seemed almost impossibly loud against the peaceful silence of the Montana afternoon. No one spoke. Ethan watched with quiet anticipation while Lily instinctively slipped her small hand into her father's again. The lid rose slowly, releasing the faint scent of aged cedar that had been sealed away for 2 decades. Inside there was no stack of money, no property deed, and no priceless family heirloom. Resting neatly inside the box was a simple fountain pen, a worn leather wallet, and one folded sheet of paper. Victoria blinked in surprise. "This is all that was inside?" she whispered. Ethan recognized the wallet immediately. "That belonged to my father." He reached toward it carefully, opening it with the same respect someone might show. An old family Bible. Inside were only a few faded photographs. One showed a young Ethan sitting on Samuel's shoulders during a county fair. Another showed Samuel standing beside his late wife beneath a cottonwood tree. Tucked behind the photographs was a small receipt from a roadside diner dated more than 20 years earlier. Ethan smiled softly. He kept everything that reminded him of the people he loved. Victoria carefully unfolded the final sheet of paper. Unlike the letter she had just read, this page contained only a few handwritten lines. She read them aloud. "If you have opened this box, then you already understand that people are always more valuable than possessions. These are the only things I own that ever truly mattered. The pen reminds me that words can build hope. The wallet reminds me that family is wealth. Everything else can be replaced." Lily quietly looked at the old fountain pen. "Grandpa thought a pen was treasure?" Ethan smiled gently. He used it every night to write birthday cards, thank you notes, and little messages he left on the refrigerator. He believed words stayed with people much longer than gifts. Victoria held the pen between her fingers with unexpected reverence. She had signed contracts worth billions of dollars with expensive custom pens, yet none of them had ever carried the meaning of this simple writing instrument. "He was teaching me one last lesson," she said quietly. "Success is not what we leave inside a bank. It is what we leave inside another person's heart." Ethan slowly nodded. "That sounds exactly like the man who raised me." The afternoon sunlight reached across the porch and settled gently over the photographs, as though time itself had paused to honor Samuel's quiet legacy. Victoria carefully returned every item to the cedar box before looking at Ethan with calm sincerity. "I spent 20 years believing I owed your father something. Now I finally understand that he never expected repayment because he had already received what mattered most. He believed one act of kindness would continue through someone else." Ethan looked across the valley where golden fields stretched toward the distant mountains. "Then we should make sure it does." Victoria smiled, her expression lighter than it had been since arriving. I have already decided that Hayes Global will establish the Samuel Brooks Foundation. It will quietly help working families facing difficult seasons, without publicity, without ceremonies, and without anyone being asked to repay a single dollar. Ethan immediately shook his head, though his voice remained kind. If my father were sitting here, he would ask you to change one thing. Victoria tilted her head slightly. What would that be? Ethan smiled with the same quiet dignity that had once belonged to Samuel Brooks. He would tell you not to put his name on it. He would tell you to help people so well that they never need to know who made it possible. For a long moment, no one spoke. The quiet that settled over the old farmhouse did not feel empty. It felt complete. The golden light of late afternoon stretched across the porch, wrapping the weathered boards in a gentle glow while the distant mountains stood unchanged, just as they had when Samuel Brooks had first driven home with grease on his hands and hope in his heart. Victoria looked at Ethan with a smile that carried neither the confidence of a celebrated chief executive nor the weight of someone trying to repay an impossible debt. It was the peaceful smile of a woman who had finally found the answer she had been searching for across 20 years. You are right, she said softly. He would never have wanted his name displayed on buildings or engraved on plaques. He believed the best kindness was the kind that asked for no applause. Ethan nodded. Then let the families who receive help believe that life simply gave them another chance. That would make him happier than any monument ever could. Victoria gently closed the cedar box and placed it beside the old rocking chair. That is exactly what I will do. Lily suddenly climbed down from the porch step and disappeared inside the house. A minute later, she returned carrying a small framed photograph of Samuel Brooks, setting it carefully in the center of the old porch table. She looked at the picture and smiled. Grandpa should eat dinner with us. Ethan felt his eyes fill with quiet emotion. I think he already does, sweetheart. Victoria looked at the photograph before turning toward the kitchen window, where warm light had begun shining through the curtains. She realized something that every award, every promotion, and every financial success had failed to teach her. A house became a home, not because of its size, but because love continued to live there long after someone was gone. As evening settled across the valley, Ethan prepared a simple meal while Lily carefully arranged 3 plates, and then quietly added a 4th in front of Samuel's photograph. No one corrected her. No one needed to. Victoria helped carry the glasses to the table without being asked. The movements felt natural, almost familiar, as though she had somehow been expected all along. They shared stories instead of speeches, laughter instead of ceremony, and gratitude instead of regret. Before the meal began, Ethan picked up his father's old fountain pen and placed it gently into Victoria's hand. Keep it, he said. My father trusted you with his final lesson. I think he would want you to keep writing new chapters for other families. Victoria looked down at the pen, then slowly closed her fingers around it. I promise every decision I make from this day forward will honor what he believed. Ethan smiled warmly. You already are. Outside, the first evening stars began appearing above the Montana sky, while a cool breeze carried the scent of pine across the quiet fields. Nothing about the farmhouse had changed. The paint was still faded. The porch still creaked. Tomorrow Ethan would still wake before sunrise, pack Lily's lunch, and go to work with his hands. Yet everything had changed because one forgotten act of kindness had finally come home. Samuel Brooks had never become famous. He had never become wealthy. The world would never write history books about the humble mechanic from a quiet Montana town. But his compassion had traveled farther than he ever imagined, living first in a frightened young woman who became a leader, then in a devoted son who chose dignity over bitterness, and now in a little girl who believed every family should save a place at the table for love. Sometimes the greatest inheritance is never found inside a bank account, a will, or a locked cedar box. Sometimes it lives quietly inside ordinary people who choose grace over pride, generosity over recognition, and hope over fear. And when that happens, one simple act of kindness can echo across generations, reminding the world that the richest legacy any person can leave behind is a heart that teaches others how to keep giving.